JD Vance needed only 8 words to completely freeze Nancy Pelosi and expose a $278 million secret that Washington tried to hide. Vance said exactly 8 words to Nancy Pelosi. For a leader who had spent roughly 4 decades surviving committee hearings, media storms, scandals, partisan battles, and every calculated ambush the Capitol could manufacture, those 8 words achieved what practically nothing else ever could. They stopped her dead in her tracks. She parted her lips, but zero sound emerged. There was no practiced counterpunch, no casual dismissal, and no neatly prepared statement regarding openness, the law, or political theatrics. There was solely a silence so absolute that everybody present realized something had shattered. Then, Nancy Pelosi grabbed her binder, rose from the seat she had commanded with the sheer assurance of a person used to dominating such spaces, and exited without providing the response the whole room anticipated. There was no parting justification, no concluding speech, and no mocking grin directed at the press. And later that evening, a far more telling detail emerged. Not a single Democratic ally scrambled to the microphones to excuse what had just unfolded. This whole showdown was centered around a red folder. Yet before JD Vance unsealed it, he ensured the audience grasped the vital metric that gave the file its weight, 838%. That represented the documented expansion of a single household's stock investments across roughly 10 years. Whereas the general market climbed about 256%, it is a gap so massive that describing it as just smart trading practically mocks the intellect of anybody who has spent their life seeing standard retirement funds inch higher by tiny fractions annually. No typical educator, mechanic, caregiver, freight driver, or local shop proprietor gets to observe an 838% yield and nonchalantly assume they merely enjoyed a lucky decade. Returns of that magnitude instantly provoke a highly unsettling inquiry regarding privileged data, market timing, and who truly grasps the game before the general public is compelled to participate. Nancy Pelosi wasn't sitting there as a licensed financial planner, hedge fund director, Wall Street broker, or economic expert whose livelihood relied on outperforming the charts. She was among the most influential legislators in the nation. She was a figure who spent decades crafting the precise legislative and oversight framework within which all other citizens purchased and traded shares. That fact is what rendered the statistic politically explosive. The core problem was never merely that the assets increased, but that they surged astronomically while the individuals linked to that fortune sat in chambers where legislation capable of shifting whole sectors was argued, scheduled, brokered, and enacted. Pelosi walked into Dirksen 138 and adjusted the mic with the ease of an official who had performed this exact ritual more times than most leaders could recall. Sitting opposite her was Vance, the red folder resting sealed on his desk. She instantly deployed her tenure as a weapon, reminding him she was holding court in such venues back when he was in Ohio drafting his memoir. She framed the dialogue as a seasoned pro, handling a rookie peer who perhaps confused a media stunt for a legitimate inquiry. It was a textbook Capitol Hill maneuver, not an answer, but a threat. I have operated here longer than you. I understand how these chambers function, and you aren't going to surprise me. Vance didn't confront the grandstanding because it wasn't necessary. He just pivoted back to the 838% figure, noting he reviewed it 3 times because the initial 2 times he assumed he must have misunderstood it. Pelosi fired back with the excuse that became her primary shield that morning, stating the data was public, the reports were accessible, and anybody possessing a computer and spare time could view them. Vance agreed, and that concession mattered. He wasn't attempting to push the weak narrative that anything was stashed in a hidden safe or obscured inside files that nobody could access. He picked up the red file, placed it right in front of him, neatly aligned the corners with 2 fingertips, and left it shut. This transformed an ordinary item into an unanswered question resting between them on the polished table. He informed Pelosi that one specific September day was inside that binder, representing one transaction, and that they would get to it eventually. But only after walking the slower route through the record, so the weight of that date couldn't be dismissed as a random accident pulled from context. Pelosi's gaze darted to the file before snapping back to his face. Then, she grabbed the backup armor that had shielded her through years of public criticism. She didn't trade stocks. Her husband did. Vance didn't push back on that statement either. By declining to attack the shield right away, he allowed Pelosi to continuously restate it until those very words became part of the record he planned to return to later. Next, he narrowed the debate to 2024. 1 year, one comparison, and one outcome that was impossible to hide under decades of political biography or procedural jargon. Based on the metrics outlined in the script, the Pelosi family portfolio returned 70.9% that year, whereas the broader market returned 24.9%. This meant her family's wealth outpaced an already robust market by a staggering margin. Pelosi responded that if those were the numbers in the paperwork, then those were the numbers. She quickly added that she didn't spend her time memorizing percentages because she had a country to help run. That reply tried to make the figure sound administrative, something for accountants, reporters, or partisan rivals to fixate on, while she remained focused on larger duties. Vance instead dragged the percentage out of the spreadsheet and forced it into the world average Americans actually inhabit, because a number becomes much tougher to wave away when compared with what real folks discover upon opening their retirement statements after 30 years of labor. He argued that beating the market by a couple of points can be called an excellent year, maybe even a lucky one, but crushing it by roughly 46 points is something entirely different, particularly when the person tied to that family fortune sits at the center of federal policymaking. Somewhere, he essentially noted, a laborer could spend decades contributing to a pension, watch it rise 4%, and feel thankful that the cash survived inflation, layoffs, recessions, and everything else thrown at working families. Pelosi's household, conversely, experienced a year where the gains resembled not patient retirement planning, but the kind of performance Wall Street professionals spend lifetimes hunting and usually fail to produce. The point wasn't that everyday citizens were robbed dollar for dollar every time her portfolio rose. It was that they were being asked to trust that the market was equally fair while watching political families repeatedly produce results that seemed almost untouchable. The outrage embedded in Vance's argument came from that contrast. Millions of Americans supposedly play the same game, yet some people appear to sit close enough to the rule book that the game never feels remotely the same. Pelosi responded with the strongest version of her legal defense, stressing that every trade had been publicly disclosed within the required period, and insisting that nothing was hidden or secret. Then she demanded to know what Vance was actually accusing her of. It was a smart move, because it tried to force him into alleging an identifiable crime instead of letting him keep attacking the ethical structure surrounding congressional stock trading. For a moment, it was exactly the kind of answer that had probably ended countless interviews, because legality is a powerful shield when critics speak loosely, and hope outrage can substitute for precision. Vance refused to give her that escape route, telling her he was not accusing her of breaking the law and that this was exactly the point almost everyone misunderstood. His argument was more damaging politically. He was not asking why Pelosi had violated the rules. He was asking why lawmakers were allowed to operate under rules that could remain technically legal while producing outcomes that looked obscene to the citizens expected to trust them. That distinction shifted the confrontation away from criminality and toward legitimacy. It was a point far more difficult to answer, with a filing deadline or a disclosure form. If every transaction was legal, then the uncomfortable issue became whether Congress had designed a system generous enough to protect its own members, while demanding that ordinary investors accept whatever information reached them after the market had already moved. Vance tied that argument to school teachers, steel workers, nurses, pension holders, and people who put money into index funds because they had neither the time nor the access to behave like professional traders. Pelosi dismissed the speech as emotionally effective but irrelevant to her. This gave Vance the exact opening he had been waiting for, because the next step was no longer about abstract fairness. He moved from percentages to a specific sector, a specific period, and a specific set of purchases involving semiconductors. Vance pointed to December 2022 and described large semiconductor positions in the Pelosi household portfolio, including Nvidia. He followed this by noting congressional action affecting the future of the semiconductor industry and billions of dollars in federal support directed toward that sector. Pelosi again returned to the same explanation: her husband managed the portfolio. She did not personally follow the trades, she did not sit at a computer placing orders, and that arrangement had long been how their household handled investments. Vance still did not interrupt the defense or accuse her of personally clicking a buy button. The more valuable move was to let her state the separation clearly and repeatedly. He wrote a single line on the yellow pad in front of him, not theatrically, not triumphantly, but with the deliberate patience of someone preserving exact language for later use. Pelosi was defending herself in the moment, but Vance was building a record. Every time she returned to the same sentence about her husband handling the trades, that record grew tighter around the argument he was preparing. He then repeated her position back to her in plain terms, making certain that there could be no later suggestion that he had misunderstood what she meant. Her husband handled the portfolio, and she did not follow the transactions. Pelosi confirmed it. Vance answered simply that this mattered, adding that it was going to matter more than she knew. At that point, the red folder remained closed, the September trade remained unrevealed, and the most damaging evidence in the script had not yet been placed on the table, but the foundation was already there. The 838% figure had established the scale. The 70.9% return had established the extraordinary performance. The Nvidia discussion had introduced the question of timing around congressional action, and Pelosi herself had repeatedly placed distance between her public office and her family's trading decisions. Vance had not yet sprung the trap, but by the time this portion of the hearing ended, Pelosi had already supplied him with the exact defense he would later turn against her. Vance looked down at his notes for a long moment, and when he spoke again, the pace changed. He stopped talking about returns, filings, semiconductor positions, and percentages, and moved instead toward the people who never get invited into the rooms where those percentages become possible. He spoke about his mother working through much of her life in Ohio, putting away whatever little she could whenever there was something left after the bills, only to discover that inflation and ordinary hardship could grind years of savings down until retirement looked less like security and more like surviving 1 month at a time. That was the dividing line he wanted everyone watching to understand. Because his mother had technically participated in the same market as Nancy Pelosi's household, but nobody could seriously pretend that she had participated from the same position. She did not sit near committee rooms, leadership negotiations, legislative calendars, federal subsidy debates, or the machinery that could move billions of dollars through entire industries with a single vote. She got the public market after Washington had acted. Meanwhile, people inside Washington lived close enough to the machinery that pretending the two experiences were equivalent required a level of political arrogance that ordinary Americans had every reason to resent. The room went quiet, and Vance closed the thin file he had been using. He was finished with the first layer of the argument and ready to move Pelosi onto a different piece of ground. He asked her to remember the spring of 2020, not because he wanted another investment number, but because he wanted to drag the conversation back to a period when millions of Americans were frightened, unemployed, locked out of businesses, and waiting in lines for basic necessities. Pelosi said she remembered it and called it a terrible time for the country, which was obvious enough. But Vance's point was not that she had forgotten the pandemic. It was that political memory often becomes remarkably selective when the suffering of ordinary people collides with the comfort of the people describing it. He reminded the room of the food bank lines stretching around blocks, families sitting in cars with children in the back waiting for groceries, and small businesses that had spent decades building something only to watch the doors close in a matter of weeks. He also brought up the Paycheck Protection Program running out of money, because at that moment, the country was not debating abstractions about market theory or congressional ethics, but whether millions of workers and shop owners could stay afloat long enough to see another month. Then came the television moment Pelosi clearly wished could remain trapped in the category of old partisan clips. The late-night appearance from her home when she opened an expensive freezer filled with premium ice cream and talked about getting through the lockdown. Pelosi called it a human moment that critics had clipped, distorted, and weaponized. In isolation, that defense was not ridiculous, because eating ice cream during a crisis is obviously not a crime, and nobody serious needed to pretend that the freezer itself was the scandal. Vance did not waste time attacking the ice cream. The image was useful only as a doorway into the larger contradiction he wanted to put on the table. And the larger contradiction was not dessert, but language. He returned instead to the way Pelosi had described relief money when different political parties were responsible for delivering it, placing two descriptions beside each other and allowing the hypocrisy to become visible without needing a complicated speech. That was where the exchange stopped being about a viral clip and became another example of the same Washington instinct running through the stock debate. The rules, labels, and moral judgments somehow seemed to change depending on who was holding the power. Vance reminded her that when families received $600 in relief during the pandemic, she had called the amount significant. Yet when working families had received roughly $1,200 through an earlier tax cut, she had dismissed the benefit as crumbs. Same people, same rent, same grocery bills, same kitchen tables, and the same brutal arithmetic of trying to stretch a few hundred across a month. But suddenly the political description changed because the party writing the check had changed. Pelosi accused him of flattening years of context into a soundbite, but Vance's argument was precisely that ordinary people do not get to live inside decades of congressional context when the electricity bill is due on Friday. The family whose diner disappeared, the veteran trapped on hold with an unemployment office, or the single mother calculating bills at midnight did not experience $600 as a rhetorical device inside a floor speech. They experienced it as money they either had or did not have. Pelosi could insist that context mattered, but Vance was forcing the uglier question underneath it. Why does Washington discover compassion for a dollar amount when its own side distributes it, and contempt for the same kind of money when the other side does? Pelosi finally pushed back by saying Vance had no idea what those lives were like. And that gave him the opening to answer with the contrast he had been building since the beginning of the hearing. He said he had grown up in one of those lives. Whether Pelosi liked the framing or not, it immediately changed the emotional balance of the room, because she was no longer debating an abstract Republican talking point about working-class hardship. Vance's accusation was that she read about those people in briefings, while he had eaten dinner in the same kind of homes. That distinction landed because Washington is crowded with politicians who can describe poverty in immaculate policy language while sounding as if they have never once worried about a utility being shut off. Pelosi's hand moved toward the water glass, wrapped around it, and then released it without drinking. It was a small hesitation in a hearing where she had entered, behaving as if there was nothing Vance could possibly place in front of her that she had not seen before. Then she changed tactics completely and attacked him personally. She aimed at the book that had made him nationally famous, accusing him of building a career by criticizing the very hometown, family, and people he now claimed to represent. It was her strongest counterattack of the morning because it was not procedural, it was not about disclosure law, and it was not another repetition of the husband defense that had already begun to wear thin. Vance did not dodge it, because dodging would have given Pelosi exactly what she wanted. Instead, he acknowledged that he had criticized his own people, his own community, and people culturally close to him when he believed they were wrong. More importantly, he pointed out that he had put his name on the cover, attached himself publicly to those arguments, and accepted that anyone could use them against him later, which was exactly what Pelosi was doing in that room. Then he asked her to name one moment across nearly 40 years in public life, when she had publicly told her own side that it was wrong. At a moment when doing so actually cost her something, Pelosi opened her mouth and failed to produce an answer. Vance answered the silence with a short dismissal that mattered less for its wording than for the fact that the veteran politician, who had entered lecturing him about experience, suddenly had no example ready. From there, Vance moved directly into the issue Pelosi had spent years resisting: a clean prohibition on members of Congress and their spouses trading individual stocks while holding office. The principle was brutally simple. If lawmakers are writing legislation that can affect particular industries and companies, then perhaps they and their spouses should not simultaneously be allowed to place personal bets on those same companies while the rest of the country waits outside the room. Pelosi rejected Vance's framing as an oversimplification and defended her long-standing preference for transparency rather than prohibition. She argued that disclosure rules were the appropriate answer instead of banning congressional families from participating in the market. Vance reminded her that she had previously framed participation in the market as a matter of freedom, insisting that lawmakers should retain the same basic right to invest as other American citizens. It was a defense that sounds cleaner until someone asks whether those lawmakers truly possess the same information environment as everyone else. That was the entire ethical problem compressed into one contradiction. Congress wanted to be treated like ordinary investors when buying and selling shares, while simultaneously occupying a position no ordinary investor could ever legally or practically replicate. Then Vance attacked the timing of Pelosi's eventual change of position. In his argument, the reversal did not come when the sacrifice would have been meaningful, but when the years of accumulated advantage were already behind her. He cited the growth of the family portfolio from roughly $30 million to $278 million and argued that Pelosi had resisted the restriction while there was still substantial trading ahead. She only became willing to support change near the end of her time in office, when the personal cost of that change had largely disappeared. Pelosi called that evolution the natural process of a thoughtful person learning, reconsidering, and changing over time. But Vance refused to let such a polished Washington word close the issue. He drew a harsher distinction, arguing that evolution means changing, while the decision still costs something, whereas abandoning a privilege after extracting nearly all of its value looks less like growth and more like arriving at morality once the bill has already been paid. Pelosi reached again for the oldest defense available to her, repeating that her husband made the trades, that she did not follow the details, and that she was not personally tracking what was bought, sold, or when transactions occurred. By now, the sentence no longer carried the same force it had carried earlier. This was not the first time she had used it, and every repetition made the defense sound less like a clarification and more like the only wall left standing. Her eyes shifted toward the red folder that had remained closed on the table for nearly the entire exchange. Vance finally acknowledged what she had been watching, from almost the moment he placed it there. He told her they could stop pretending the folder was not the reason the morning mattered. He placed 2 fingers on top of it and reminded her that he had promised one day in September and one specific trade. But before opening it, he said he needed one final answer, stated plainly for the camera with no ambiguity that could later be buried beneath statements about misunderstanding, context, or what somebody supposedly meant. Pelosi was about to be asked to lock herself publicly into the exact defense she had repeated all morning. This time, Vance was not collecting another talking point. He was preparing to place her own words directly beside whatever was waiting inside that red folder. Vance looked directly at Pelosi and stripped the question down until there was nowhere left for language to hide. He asked whether she was stating clearly on the record and in front of the country that she had no knowledge of her family's trades, did not follow them, and did not know what was being bought, sold, or timed. Pelosi had spent decades learning that hesitation is often more damaging than denial. So she did what experienced politicians do when they believe the safest route is certainty. she committed completely to the position she had already repeated throughout the hearing. She said that was correct, that she did not follow the trades or know the details, and that her husband had always handled the family's investments. She even turned toward the camera as she said it, giving the statement the kind of public clarity Vance had been demanding. If there was going to be a dispute later about what she meant, he wanted the country to have the answer in her own voice. Vance simply thanked her. The calmness of that response mattered because he was no longer trying to persuade her to say anything else. She had finally given him exactly what he needed. His hand rested flat across the red folder that had sat unopened through nearly the entire exchange. Then, after almost an hour of allowing that object to hang over the hearing like an unanswered accusation, he opened it. There was no dramatic stack of secret documents, no mountain of paperwork designed to overwhelm the room. Only a single page, which made the moment sharper because one page is harder to dismiss as noise. Vance turned it toward the camera and began with September, identifying a large sale of Visa shares by Pelosi's husband, emphasizing that the transaction was contained in the public filing sitting in his hand. Then he moved immediately to the timing. According to the script, one day after that sale, the Department of Justice announced a major federal lawsuit against Visa. The stock fell after the announcement, but the Pelosi household, as Vance framed it, had already moved out before the news reached the public market. That was the point where the hearing stopped being a broad argument about whether congressional stock trading looks bad and became a question about timing so precise that it demanded an explanation. One day is not the same as 1 quarter, 1 month, or even 1 week. Vance deliberately repeated the distance because the entire force of the allegation depended on making everyone in the room understand how narrow that window was. Then he returned to the Nvidia positions from December 2022, the semiconductor purchases discussed earlier in the hearing, and placed them beside congressional action involving billions of dollars for the semiconductor industry. The two episodes were different in every obvious surface detail, different companies, different years, different government actions. But Vance's argument was that they appeared to share the same essential feature. The Pelosi household seemed to move before developments that could materially affect the value of those positions. He did not need to introduce another speech about fairness because the sequence itself was doing the work now. All of the names he had planted earlier in the hearing suddenly came back together in a single pattern. Visa in September, Nvidia before semiconductor legislation, one position sold before damaging federal action, and another position acquired before favorable government spending affected the industry. And now the hearing had reached the exact place Vance had been walking toward from the beginning. The red folder was not important because it supposedly proved an entire criminal case by itself. Inside the logic of the script, it was important because it collided directly with Pelosi's repeated claim that she knew nothing about the timing or details of the trades. Minutes earlier, she had looked into the camera and confirmed again that she did not follow what was bought, sold, or when transactions occurred. Vance now forced those two things into the same frame, not allowing the defense to remain isolated from the trading pattern he had just described. That was the trap. The more confidently Pelosi had separated herself from the investments, the more extraordinary the timing had to become if that separation was accepted completely. Vance reduced the situation to two possibilities, and neither one was comfortable. Either Pelosi truly knew nothing, and her family had repeatedly achieved remarkable timing through pure chance, or she knew more than she had just told the country under oath. He described the first possibility with deliberate sarcasm, asking the room to believe that the household had somehow exited Visa one day before major federal action and entered Nvidia before congressional activity benefiting the semiconductor sector without any meaningful awareness of what was coming. That explanation required the audience to accept a level of luck so consistent that it would embarrass professional traders who spend their entire careers trying to anticipate exactly those kinds of market-moving developments. The second possibility was politically worse. It would mean that the shield Pelosi had used throughout the hearing, the repeated insistence that her husband handled everything and she knew none of the details, was not telling the whole story. Vance did not need to announce which explanation he believed, because the structure of the question made his position obvious. Everyone in the room understood why he had spent so much time making Pelosi repeat the same defense before opening the folder. Pelosi opened her mouth, and for the first time that morning, the machinery that had carried her through countless hostile interviews and hearings produced nothing. There was no quick procedural objection, no accusation that Vance was removing context, no return to disclosure requirements, and no reminder that her husband handled the investments. Every one of those responses had already been used, and everyone now sat inside the record beside the page in front of her. Vance waited, and then he lowered his voice instead of raising it, delivering the short line the script had been building toward. "You knew the day before." The effect came from restraint rather than volume. Shouting would have made the moment feel like performance, while saying it quietly forced the accusation to sit by itself in the silence. Nobody in the room erupted, nobody applauded, and nobody needed to, because the silence was far more damaging than any partisan reaction could have been. The cameras kept running, while Pelosi remained motionless, looking down at the page without picking it up. The longer she sat there without answering, the less believable it became that more time would somehow produce a response strong enough to reverse what the room had just watched. The chairman gave her the opportunity to respond, then allowed the pause to stretch longer. But the problem was no longer a lack of time. The problem was that every available answer appeared to carry its own cost. If she repeated that she knew nothing, Vance's argument about impossible timing remained standing. If she admitted awareness, the statement she had just made to the camera immediately became the center of the confrontation. The political veteran who had begun the morning reminding Vance how long she had been operating in Washington now found herself trapped, not by a complicated statute or an obscure technical rule, but by her own repeated words placed beside a single page. That was why the red folder worked. Inside this confrontation, it did not need to create a new defense problem, because it turned the defense Pelosi had already chosen into the problem itself. Then Pelosi began gathering her leather folder, keeping her hands controlled as she prepared to leave the chair that she had occupied so confidently only minutes earlier. She did not look toward the camera she had addressed when affirming her lack of knowledge, and she did not offer a final explanation on the way out. The hearing had reached the point where another polished sentence would have sounded weaker than the silence already hanging over the table. She stood and walked out first. It was an extraordinary image precisely because the script had framed her as someone who had spent nearly 40 years in Washington mastering rooms like this, rather than abandoning them. Vance did not smile, celebrate, or watch her exit like a man enjoying a personal victory. He simply closed the red folder, squared the edges with 2 fingers, exactly as he had done at the beginning, and placed both hands on top of it. The gesture returned the scene to where it had started, except now the folder was no longer a mystery. Pelosi's defense was no longer intact, and the country watching the clip had been given a much uglier question about whether the people writing the rules had ever really been playing the same market as everyone else. For the ordinary viewer, that was the broader accusation Vance wanted to leave behind. Millions of people had spent years watching political families build enormous fortunes while insisting that every transaction was legal, disclosed, and therefore beyond criticism. Legality had been presented as the final answer for so long that Washington seemed almost offended whenever citizens asked whether something could comply with the rules and still reveal that the rules themselves were rotten. The hearing turned that frustration into a visible confrontation. It placed the spectacular growth of the Pelosi family portfolio beside congressional power, industry legislation, the Visa timing, the Nvidia purchases, and Pelosi's repeated insistence that she knew nothing about the trades. Vance's case in the script was not that one page magically explained 4 decades of political life. It was that one page made the old explanation far harder to accept without swallowing an extraordinary amount of coincidence. Pelosi had entered the room treating the hearing like another challenge she had survived 100 times before, but she left with the red folder closed behind her. The most damaging part of the confrontation was already captured on camera. What remained after Pelosi walked out was not celebration, but the image itself, the page on the table, the closed red folder, the empty chair, and the unanswered accusation that had suddenly become far more powerful than another hour of argument could ever have been. The camera stayed on the evidence presented in the hearing. The absence of Pelosi from the chair made that evidence seem heavier because there was no longer anyone across from Vance attempting to explain it away. By that evening, according to the script, the final stretch of the hearing had spread everywhere. It was stripped down to the most damaging 90 seconds rather than the entire confrontation that had led there. Viewers saw the page, heard the accusation about the timing, watched Pelosi rise from the chair, and watched her leave a room she had entered with the authority of someone who had spent decades believing she understood exactly how Washington confrontations worked. That short sequence traveled because it appeared to give visible form to a suspicion millions of Americans had carried for years that some people close to political power seemed to operate under conditions ordinary citizens could never access. The most revealing part of the aftermath, as the script frames it, was not the volume of Republican attacks, but the absence of Democratic defenses. Pelosi had spent decades building alliances, raising money, leading her party, standing beside candidates, protecting members, and helping shape Democratic strategy through some of the most bitter political fights in modern Washington. Yet after the clip spread, the script says not one Democrat stepped forward to make the case that she had been unfairly treated or that Vance's presentation had fundamentally misrepresented what happened. Silence from opponents means nothing, but silence from allies can become its own political statement. Allies usually know exactly when a defense would force them to inherit the controversy themselves. The people who had stood beside Pelosi through years of partisan warfare had watched the same sequence everyone else watched. The absence of a coordinated defense allowed the red folder, the Visa timing, and the unanswered question to dominate the story without meaningful interruption. Then came the institutional consequence that gave the confrontation a second life beyond the viral clip. The issue of congressional stock trading could no longer be treated like some abstract ethics proposal buried behind committee language. Pelosi had resisted a clean ban for years, according to the script, defending disclosure and the freedom of lawmakers to participate in the market rather than accepting a prohibition on members and their immediate families trading individual stocks. But near the end of her time in office, the political environment moved in the opposite direction. The House passed a ban with 232 votes, covering members of Congress, spouses, and children. The exact principle Vance had forced into the center of the hearing suddenly became law. In the script's telling, people writing rules capable of moving companies and industries would no longer be allowed to personally trade individual stocks as though their relationship to government information were identical to that of an ordinary investor. What Pelosi had once treated as an unnecessary restriction became, on her way out, a reform closely associated in the public mind with the very controversy surrounding her family's portfolio. That reversal mattered because laws do not exist only as words on paper. They also carry stories about why the public finally became angry enough to demand them. Pelosi had spent years arguing that transparency was sufficient, that disclosure could protect the integrity of the system, and that members of Congress should not be treated as though participation in the stock market were itself a form of corruption. But after years of attention on her family's trades and the staggering growth figures attached to the portfolio, her household had become, in the script, the most obvious political example critics could point to when explaining why disclosure alone no longer satisfied the public. A rule that once seemed technical had become visceral. Voters did not need a law degree to understand the conflict inherent in lawmakers regulating industries while their families bought and sold shares tied to those same industries. The argument had shifted from whether every filing deadline had been met to whether anyone should ever be placed in a position where the public has to wonder if timing came from skill coincidence, or proximity to power. That was where the $278 million figure stopped looking merely like wealth and began looking, inside the script's argument, like part of a political indictment. The family portfolio had reportedly grown from about $30 million to roughly $278 million. It was an accumulation so dramatic that every later debate over congressional stock trading inevitably dragged Pelosi's name back into the discussion, whether she wanted it there or not. Money could purchase influence, security, property, advisors, lawyers, and every comfort available to the political class, but it could not erase the visual of a public official facing a page she could not immediately explain. For a politician with nearly 40 years of a Washington history behind her, that was the deeper damage. Careers of that length are usually remembered through legislation, leadership positions, election victories, institutional battles, and the careful construction of legacy. Yet one controversy can become the shorthand through which everything else is interpreted, especially when the reform passed afterward appears designed to prevent future lawmakers from operating under the same conditions that created the controversy in the first place. The script, therefore, turns Pelosi's legacy into something harsher than a partisan defeat, portraying it as a warning embedded in the system she spent decades helping lead. She had worried, like almost every major political figure eventually worries, about how history would describe her once the cameras were gone and the daily fights of Washington no longer mattered. But the story presented here argues that history would now place congressional stock trading near the front of that legacy, not because one hearing erased everything she had done, but because the controversy crystallized a broader public distrust that had been accumulating for years. The most punishing outcome for a politician is not always a criminal sentence, a fine, or losing an election. Sometimes it is watching your name become the example future lawmakers cite when explaining why a privilege had to be restricted. The reform then becomes a permanent reminder that the public finally decided the old arrangement could no longer be defended, simply by pointing to paperwork and saying everything had technically been disclosed. That is why the final argument reaches beyond Pelosi herself and goes directly at the American viewer, who had been told for years that suspicion toward Washington was merely cynicism. People watched members of Congress become wealthy, watched industries move after legislative decisions, and watched political families make extraordinary trades. They were repeatedly told that unless they could produce proof of an explicit crime, they had no legitimate reason to question what they were seeing. The public was asked to believe that everyone played under the same rules, even when one group wrote those rules, received briefings, shaped legislation, controlled schedules, and remained physically closer to government decisions than any ordinary investor could ever hope to be. Vance's confrontation worked politically because it refused to accept legality as the end of the discussion. Instead, it treated legality as the beginning of a much more uncomfortable question about fairness, access, and institutional trust. The red folder became powerful not because red paper possesses some magical evidentiary value, but because it symbolized the moment when years of diffuse suspicion were compressed into one transaction, one date, one answer, and one silence. The $30 million becoming $278 million was therefore never presented merely as a story about successful investing. If that were all it meant, there would have been nothing politically explosive about it. The script presents it as a story about what happens when people entrusted to write the rules live under a system that allows them to participate financially in markets directly affected by decisions made inside the institutions they prior control. Pelosi's repeated defense was that her husband handled the investments and that every required filing was public. But Vance's answer was that the country should not have to choose between accepting extraordinary coincidence and wondering whether lawmakers possessed advantages unavailable to everyone else. By the end of the hearing, the debate had moved beyond one trade, one company, or even one politician, and into the larger question of whether public trust can survive when Washington keeps insisting that technical compliance is enough. That was the thing left on the table after Pelosi walked out, and it was far harder to close than the red folder. For years, Americans had been told that bitterness created suspicion, that frustration with political wealth was jealousy, and that people questioning the fairness of the system simply did not understand how government or markets actually worked. The script turns that accusation around and argues that what citizens were experiencing was not paranoia, but pattern recognition. It was the repeated observation that the people closest to power somehow seemed to land on the favorable side of outcomes ordinary families could never anticipate. Vance's hearing did not need to prove every suspicion anyone had ever carried about Washington to make that feeling politically devastating. It only needed to show why asking questions about those patterns was legitimate rather than irrational. Pelosi entered believing seniority, disclosure rules, and the familiar separation between her office and her husband's trading decisions would be enough to carry her through another confrontation. But the script ends with those defenses unable to explain the timing Vance placed before her. And so the number that opened the entire story, 838%, returned at the end, not as a trophy of financial brilliance, but as the symbol of a system that ordinary Americans had finally decided they were no longer willing to trust without demanding an answer.